We've all watched the glittering balls in Bridgerton and admired the beautiful gowns, the orchestras, and the romantic dances. But have you ever wondered why everyone looks so anxious despite being at what seems like a fancy party? Why are the mothers watching their daughters like hawks? And why does one whispered rumor or wrong dance partner feel like the end of the world? The answer is not as simple as you think as we go through the insane details that went into organizing these balls. In the Regency era, balls were formal social institutions with very specific objectives. They weren't about having fun, though that might happen if you were lucky. The primary purposes included facilitating marriage alliances, displaying family wealth and social rank, reinforcing hierarchy within the ton, and allowing controlled interaction between unmarried men and women under constant supervision. As we'll see throughout this video, supervision wasn't just about keeping young ladies safe, it was about protecting something far more valuable: reputation. A ball was one of the few socially acceptable environments where young women could be seen, evaluated, and approached by potential suitors. But here's the thing: attendance alone signaled status. If your family received an invitation to the right ball, it meant you were accepted by society. If you didn't, well, you might as well not exist in the ton. Hosting a successful ball elevated a family's reputation significantly, but failing to host properly, or worse, having something go wrong at your ball, could damage your standing for years. And what's even crazier is that something going wrong could be as simple as inviting the wrong person or your daughter being seen alone with a man for 30 seconds. So who actually hosted these nerve-wracking events? There were different types of balls, each with its own social weight. Wealthy families hosted aristocratic private balls in their London townhouses or country estates. These were invitation only and carefully curated, which we'll get to in a moment because the guest list was absolutely critical. The motivations for hosting were clear: introduce daughters to society, strengthen alliances with other powerful families, signal financial stability to potential suitors and their families, and compete subtly with rival families. Yes, it was a competition. Portia Featherington understood this perfectly when she was desperate to get her daughters noticed. Then there were patronage balls, sometimes hosted by a socially dominant figure such as a duchess or an influential matron like Lady Danbury. Receiving an invitation to one of these balls implied social approval from someone powerful. It was like getting a stamp of legitimacy. Without it, you could be wealthy, but still be nobody. There were also assembly and subscription balls, which were public but still exclusive. Attendees paid a subscription fee, and these events were still highly regulated and attended mainly by the upper classes. They were common in spa towns like Bath and Brighton, where families would visit during certain seasons. But here's where it gets intense. Planning a ball required weeks or months of preparation. This wasn't something you could throw together at the last minute. The planning included selecting an appropriate date within the social season, sending formal handwritten invitations, hiring musicians and dance leaders, coordinating food and refreshments, preparing the house for large-scale entertaining, and organizing staff and security. The social season typically ran from late winter through early summer when Parliament was in session and aristocratic families were in London. Miss this window, and you'd have to wait an entire year for another chance to get your daughters married off. And speaking of invitations, this is where the real gatekeeping happened. Invitations were handwritten and delivered by servants, which already tells you how formal this was. But the key rules around invitations were ruthless. Invitations implied social equality between the host and the guest. This meant that one wrong guest could damage the entire event and, by extension, your family's reputation. Families guarded guest lists as carefully as they guarded their fortunes. If you invite someone scandalous or of questionable reputation, other guests might refuse to attend, or worse, they might attend and gossip about your poor judgment for months afterward. Unmarried women were often invited strategically to maximize desirable matches. A hostess might invite a particular young lady specifically because she knew an eligible bachelor would be attending. It was all very calculated. But here's what's wild. Uninvited attendance was socially catastrophic. If someone showed up without an invitation, it was considered a major breach of etiquette. A family newly risen in wealth, like the Featheringtons with their inherited title, could be excluded from the best balls for years until they were properly vetted by society. Money alone didn't guarantee acceptance. Now let's talk about the actual venue and physical setup, because hosting a ball wasn't something every family could do, even if they wanted to. Balls were held in the largest rooms of the house, which meant your house had to be massive. Common features included removing furniture to create open dance floors, using chandeliers and candlelight for illumination since there was no electricity, strategically placing mirrors to enhance light and create a sense of grandeur, and designating separate rooms for supper and refreshments. If your home wasn't large enough to host a ball properly, you simply didn't host one. Trying to host in a space that was too small would be embarrassing and damage your reputation just as much as any other social misstep. Music was another essential element, always live. This typically included small orchestras or ensembles, with professional musicians explicitly hired for the evening. There was usually a master of ceremonies or dance leader who would call out the dances and keep everything organized. The dances themselves were formal and structured, including country dances, quadrilles, and reels. And here's something most people don't realize. Dance order was incredibly meaningful. Opening dances were reserved for high-status guests or debutantes being presented to society. Getting asked to dance first was a huge honor. Getting overlooked, like Penelope often was in the early seasons, was publicly humiliating. Dancing allowed conversation, which was one of the few opportunities for young men and women to actually talk. But it also enforced physical boundaries. The steps of the dances kept couples at arm's length most of the time, with only brief moments of closer contact. Improper behavior during a dance was immediately noticed by everyone watching. It gets crazier because dress codes were not optional. Clothing was a form of social currency in the Regency era. For women, this meant white or pale gowns for debutantes to signal their innocence and availability for marriage, gloves that were absolutely required and never removed in public, hair styled formally with feathers or jewels depending on rank, and jewelry that indicated wealth and family rank. For men, the dress code included tailcoats, waistcoats, and breeches or trousers, depending on the year, along with gloves and polished shoes. Everything had to be perfect. Repeating gowns too frequently could spark gossip about financial troubles, but overly extravagant display could also attract criticism for being showy or trying too hard. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention. Food and refreshments were provided, but balls were not primarily dinner events. Food was served later in the evening, usually around midnight or after. Standard offerings included cold meats, pies, syllabubs and creams, pastries and cakes, and wine and punch. However, excessive drinking was frowned upon. Respectability had to be maintained at all times, which meant everyone was monitoring everyone else's consumption. A young man who drank too much could damage his reputation. A young woman who appeared even slightly affected by alcohol could be ruined. Now here's where we get to the heart of why balls were so stressful: chaperones and supervision. Young unmarried women were never, ever unmonitored. Their chaperones, usually mothers, aunts, or married female relatives, had very specific roles. They had to observe all interactions between their charges and any men, prevent any impropriety, no matter how small, control who their daughters danced with and in what order, and above all, protect their reputation. Because here's the devastating truth. A woman left alone with a man could be ruined socially, even without any wrongdoing actually occurring. This is why we see so much anxiety around characters being caught alone together in Bridgerton. When Daphne and Simon were discovered alone in the garden, it forced an engagement. When Marina was found to be pregnant, she became completely unmarriageable. When Penelope was alone with Colin in a carriage, it was scandalous enough that they had to marry to protect her reputation. These weren't exaggerations for drama, but reality. The financial cost of hosting a ball was enormous, which connects directly back to how money worked in that era. Costs included staff wages and overtime for the dozens of servants needed to pull off an event of this scale, food and drink for potentially hundreds of guests, musicians who didn't come cheap, candles and decor since lighting alone could cost a fortune, and wear and tear on the home from all those people. Only families with stable incomes from land, rents, or inherited wealth could afford to host regularly. This is why the Featheringtons were in such trouble after Lord Featherington died, leaving them in debt. Portia was desperately trying to maintain appearances by continuing to host and attend balls, but she couldn't afford it. Hosting balls without sufficient funds risked financial strain and public embarrassment if people figured out you were broke. And the social consequences of balls were massive, which is why families put themselves through all of this stress and expense. A successful ball could secure advantageous marriages for your daughters, raise your family's standing in society, and attract influential allies who could help your sons in business or politics. But a failed ball could spark gossip that would last for years, signal declining wealth to potential suitors who would then avoid your daughters, and damage your daughter's marriage prospects permanently. Balls were remembered and discussed long after they ended. Lady Whistledown made her fortune writing about them because people were obsessed with analyzing every detail. The level of surveillance at these events was intense. Mothers weren't just watching their own daughters, they were watching everyone. Who danced with whom, how many times, how long they talked, whether they touched inappropriately, and who went outside for fresh air and with whom. Every single interaction was noted, judged, and potentially reported in the gossip sheets the next day. This is why characters in Bridgerton are constantly looking around nervously, why they steal glances, why a simple touch of hands feels so charged with meaning, because every gesture could be interpreted, misinterpreted, or weaponized. What's even more intense is that the rules weren't the same for everyone. A wealthy duke could get away with behavior that would ruin a baron's son. A woman from an established family might survive a minor scandal, while a woman from a newly wealthy family would be destroyed by the same mistake. The system was designed to keep power in the hands of those who already had it, and balls were one of the main mechanisms for enforcing that hierarchy. Interestingly, while Bridgerton exaggerates diversity, frequency, and emotional freedom for modern storytelling, the core mechanics of balls remain historically accurate. If anything, real Regency balls were often more rigid, quieter, and socially tense than their fictional portrayals. The show gives us dramatic music and passionate glances, but reality was probably a lot of standing around, forced small talk, and barely concealed anxiety about whether you were doing everything right. So the next time you watch a ball scene in Bridgerton and think it looks magical, remember what was really happening. The beautiful gowns and candlelight were just decorations for what was essentially a high-stakes marriage market where reputations were made and destroyed in a single evening. And that's why everyone looks so stressed despite being at what seems like the event of the season.